let's dive right in. I wanted to start by asking you, Brittany. You know extremely well how powerful a tool data is. I'm wondering, what are the different ways, would you say, has it been used during the pandemic to help contain the virus's spread?
Of course. So the ways in which data collection has increased during this coronavirus pandemic is really exponential. We never expected the entire world to be leading nearly a completely digital life at any point soon. So when the world shut down in March, all of a sudden, people that have spent all of their time doing face-to-face work are all of a sudden fully on devices. Now, I should also point out, anyone that already spent most of their work time on devices every day, still, in general, the population has not been very digitally literate. And what I mean by digital literacy is that we understand what our data rights are. We understand basic cybersecurity protocols, how to be emotionally intelligent online, how to have media literacy to spot fake news and disinformation, how to not be addicted to our devices and harm our mental and physical health while living a digital life every day. So the amount of data that we've produced has absolutely skyrocketed. And that means the amount of data that is being collected about us by big tech companies, all the platforms we're using, and our governments is increasing at the same level. Now, the way in which data has been used specifically during coronavirus is a new concept called contact tracing. I suppose it's not new for law enforcement, for military, for government, but it's something that usually big tech companies have not actually partnered on just yet. Contact tracing is when your location data is collected in a database where it also triangulates with other people who you have come into close contact with, meaning that you have spent enough time near to them that it's possible that you could have contracted coronavirus from them. In the very beginning of the coronavirus pandemic, there were certain countries, especially in Asia, where there has not been comprehensive data protection and privacy frameworks enacted yet, where coronavirus contact tracing was automatically implemented on everyone's devices. Now, in some countries, for instance, Korea, this was incredibly successful in terms of the amount of new coronavirus contractions amongst the population started to drastically drop, and they were able to start opening back up. Therefore, countries across the world started to look at using a similar method in order to alert people that they had been in contact with someone who has said that they are positive after a coronavirus test. Now, this type of mechanism can be incredibly useful, and because of the successes that we saw in other countries, I think it's definitely something that we should consider. But unfortunately, nearly the same time as contact tracing started to be rolled out automatically in many countries was the same time as the BLM movement and peaceful protests, as well as violent riots, broke out around the world. And that means that also law enforcement started to look into how they could use contact tracing. So yes, when law enforcement gets access to everybody's location data, you can tell exactly who has been to a protest, who has perhaps been involved in the violent riots and committed a crime, and law enforcement can potentially abuse that information in order to target people for arrest, even if they have only peacefully protested. So a lot of human rights campaigners, a lot of campaigners around the right to peacefully assemble have been incredibly concerned at the automatic rollout of contact tracing. So there are still some countries where contact tracing has been automatically rolled out. Even here in the United States, a lot of our new phone updates automatically put contact tracing software on our phones when you do the new update. So you don't have to automatically opt in, because the United States is an automatic opt-in in terms of your data rights. We do not have the right to be asked and then consent nationally. So therefore, we really need to think about how we are going to regulate this so that it can be successful for public health, but still protect our rights. I actually helped write the first coronavirus contact tracing data protection law in the state of New York, which just passed Senate Assembly, but has not yet been enacted into law. And it's my personal opinion that I will not use a contact tracing app until we have the data protections and the regulations to say, for instance, that this data for public health will not be shared with law enforcement. And we also put in anti-discrimination clauses to make sure that people could not be falsely targeted for participating in peaceful protest.
That's interesting. And, Nevin, you're coming at this as a scientist. I'm just wondering what you find to be the key breakthroughs that you've seen related to the use of data, as well as data and collaboration together in fighting the pandemic thus far.
Right, we're coming from a very different angle than Brittany. I mean, we're not interested in regulation. We want to remove all regulation in terms of the data that's being collected and in an attempt to share all this information. I'm a scientist at the University of California, San Francisco. We started a program focused on COVID-19 called QCRG, the QBI Coronavirus Research Group, which involves hundreds of different scientists that are now working together, I would argue, in a very unprecedented way, in a very collaborative way at UCSF. And we've expanded now to include dozens of different institutions around the world, in Europe and in Africa, in South America, and in Asia. And I realize that it's been a horrible tragedy here, this pandemic, but there's been silver linings. And one of the silver linings for me is that the research community has come together and shared information. And we're starting to realize how fast we can move when we break down those barriers, when we break down those silos, and scientists with different disciplines start to work together in very creative ways in an attempt to come up with treatments, drugs, and other type of treatments or vaccines for this particular pandemic. And the goal, I think, for scientists is to keep this infrastructure in place, this collaborative infrastructure, so that we're much more prepared for the next pandemic. And one question I have is, why aren't we doing research like this on all diseases in this very collaborative and fun way? So I want less quickly, because then we can move so much more quickly as a scientific community.
Well, and Nevin, why do you think that's not been happening, up until this point? What are the challenges that that have been faced in terms of, sharing of scientific information in the past?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I mean, I can speak about the academic community, which I'm a part of. I would argue that the academic infrastructure in many ways discourages collaboration. It's really about rewarding an individual, giving one person an award, giving one person a grant, giving one person a tenure. And this often discourages collaboration, especially for young scientists who have the best ideas. And they often shy away from collaboration. So I would argue we need to flip around the system and encourage collaboration, reward collaboration, and not discourage it. And also set up infrastructure where scientists can more easily collaborate around the world, where barriers are broken down and information can be shared more quickly. But for me, at the high level, it's really about the reward system. It has to be flipped around, and now's the time to change it. If we've ever had a clean slate, now's the time. So I'm very excited to be working in this direction, trying to flip the system so that things are much better after the dust settles here on COVID-19.
Mm-hmm. Moira, I wanted to ask you a question about, so communicating about science has been one of the most critical challenges during the pandemic. And I'm wondering, beyond this crisis, communicating complex scientific information with the public and decision makers is faced by many companies. What is your experience with this at PMI?
Well, look, I think the pandemic has really brought science into really hyper focus, is what I would describe it as. And I think with that brings enormous responsibility to scientists to be accurately communicating, to be communicating in simple language that everybody can understand, But it also brings enormous responsibility to policymakers as well. And we've seen a lot of debate happening around vaccines, around mask wearing, around social distancing measures. And I think, the way I've described it is that people are getting whiplash, because one moment a study is released and masks are the best thing that people should be doing. The next moment it is not the case. And I think part of the issue there is a misunderstanding of the scientific process. And I think that's something as scientists we have to be absolutely clear about, that science is never 100% certain about a specific issue. It takes time, it takes studies and lots of different studies looking at a particular problem from a different angle. But in the middle of a pandemic, people are stressed and they want answers now. And in fact, we did a survey recently that was fielded during the pandemic that shows that, in fact, public trust of science is pretty high. More than 3/4 of people surveyed felt that science could bring solutions to some of the world's most pressing problems, whether that be communicable diseases like coronavirus, or non-communicable diseases like the area I work in smoking and health. So public expect science to bring the answers. Scientists have a responsibility to communicate properly about what those answers are or may be, with the right degree of certainty. And policymakers also have a responsibility to listen to the scientists, to look at the science, setting aside their own personal beliefs, setting aside their own prejudice, for example, about a particular industry or a particular philosophy. In order that we can use the science in the best possible way. And I think I sit between Nevin and Brittany in terms of, yes, we need pace for innovation. Absolutely, we need to have these solutions out there and working, but at the same time, we need to move forward with care as well. And I think we need to be responsible about how we're utilizing innovation. And that's where regulation can really help. And that's really down on policymakers to make sure that we're really putting in place the best regulations to get the most out of innovation.
And that, Brittany, just along those lines, between GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation in the EU, and then also CCPA, California Consumer Privacy Act, the regulatory environment for data is trending toward less transparency, more privacy, and more personal ownership of data. And I know that your organization was founded on this belief, based on what you experienced at Cambridge Analytica. What are the scenarios where you would advocate for more transparency for the purpose of advancing global population health?
Of course, and what I would really like to, I suppose, land the plane about for everyone is that there are two major camps in the kind of privacy and data protection world. And those there's one side where we're talking about, how do we make all data private? How do we make that possible? And how do we keep all data in a way where we're going to choose if we want to share it or not, but people need to be able to fully protect and keep private all of their data. Now, that's not the side really that I come from, although for data protection, for encryption, for what technology companies need to think about on their back end, that's very important to me, because you need to be able to assert your privacy when you want it. But I'm more on the radical transparency side, which is that the more data we can share, the more problems we are going to solve. 21st century solutions are going to solve a lot of our greatest problems, everything from, terrorist attacks to mass shootings and preventing of that, to traffic accidents and curing diseases that we couldn't cure otherwise. I'm sure some of my fellow panelists can attest to this, that unfortunately the majority of the medical data worldwide skews towards young white men, especially in the United States, who go and take medical trials, for instance, and therefore medicines don't work as well on women and minorities. This is a problem of lack of access to data, because healthcare data is so massively regulated. So there are many reasons why I started the Own Your Data movement, because in data ownership, the concept is Data is a digital asset, just like any other digital assets, whether, securities, commodities. Your data, because it's your property, you get to choose who gets access to it, what they're allowed to do with it, and if they're going to monetize it, then you agree on a price before you hand away the keys, kind of like Airbnb, if you think about it that way. And so the point of data ownership is that I would be motivated to share more of my data with incentives. So for instance, just like medical trials where you get paid, I could opt in to share anonymously or pseudonymously or even completely parts of my medical data or my coronavirus positive or negative status. I could decide to share that for some sort of incentive or reward. The first time that this was really proposed in US law, well, I suppose is the data dividend law that Governor Gavin Newsom proposed in California, which is that companies have to disclose to you if they are monetizing your data, and if they are, you get a dividend off of that. We have 2 other states in the United States where you own your data as your property. In the state of Wyoming, where I am right now, your digital assets are your intangible personal property. Therefore, you have legal recourse to sue for data breaches if companies have, through negligence, allowed themselves to be hacked, for instance, like in the case of Equifax. And then specifically because of the Equifax case in the state of Minnesota, I was the only expert witness in the first successful case against Equifax where we sued them for property damage, for negligence. They had over 3,000 security certificates expire without renewing them when they were hacked. That's the lawyer that I worked with on that case said that's like leaving the door open and the lights on with the alarm off and expecting, nothing to happen to your house, right? So when we're talking about data regulation, I want to make everyone completely aware that I am the type of person that believes in the future of AI and data science. I really believe that I want more people to share more data. And as we are producing exponentially more data every day, it gives us the ability to solve more problems. But unfortunately, there are too many bad actors that have been major players in the data space, and therefore we have to regulate in order to protect people. So what I have spent a lot of time doing over the past few years is making sure that technologists are spending a lot of time with legislators. I show up in Congress with technologists all the time so that they can have meetings with legislators, so that they can testify in Congress, so that there is less of a gap between how the back end of technology actually works, how our data is collected and used, and how it's possible to protect people while allowing the driving of innovation.
Yeah, Nevin, what are your thoughts on that? The release of data, but with the guardrails to really protect individuals and their personal data.
Again, it's how you define data. There's many different types of data, and the data that we're involved generating, again, is not necessarily attributable to any one person, and therefore we don't have these concerns. We are trying to connect our type of data to clinical data. That's one of our major goals. But what I would add is kind of a build on what Moira was talking about in terms of when you have the data, how do you responsibly report it and communicate it to people that aren't familiar with the data? She was talking about policymakers. I think this is important, but I'd like to also add the press. And Moira was saying that scientists right now are held in a high listening to what cover newspapers instead of sports stars. That's kind of a nice change, although I'm going to report this information in a way that people can digest it and don't jump to the wrong conclusions. I mean, the scientific process is slow. There's no quick fixes here. That's one big message. And sometimes the press wants to get in and take your information and twist it in a way that sells newspapers. And that's something that we need to be very careful about going forward. So we really have a good communication between scientists and policymakers and the press so that the public really understands what's happening here and the timelines in terms of coming up with treatments or vaccines for COVID-19. So it's really about an understanding of what's happening and how do you communicate it? How do you make it digestible to people that aren't familiar with that data?
Moira, I had a question for you about how private and public stakeholders can work together to address health challenges. You spoke about this a bit. Can you talk about what the positive role is that regulators can play and have played in the work that you do?
Of course, and I think, you know, there are some really good examples where regulators are playing a super positive role in not only transparently communicating the science in my field, which you were looking at what we call modified risk tobacco products. So there's a completely transparent process where a company has to submit all their data. It's made wide open and displayed in public so that anybody can crawl over it, anybody can come to their own conclusions, can make comment on it. And I think that's very, very healthy because as Nevin said, science is, you know, it's difficult and it's complex and it takes a long time. And so there may be conclusions that, you know, other people can help both manufacturers and regulators come to based on their own interpretation of the data. And I think that's normal and healthy and should be encouraged. But what we're struggling with in many places, for example, outside of the United States, where there's this law that basically governs these modified risk tobacco products doesn't exist, is that policymakers are really working based on their own personal agendas or their own personal fears about smoke-free alternatives to cigarettes. And I think that's when we get into a much more difficult situation because decisions are being made not necessarily based on the wealth of scientific evidence that's available, but based on, you know, instinct or fear. And that for me is such a waste of the scientific method. It's such a waste of the data that my company and other institutions have developed and made public over more than a decade. So we have had a policy, I would guess you could describe it as aggressive transparency. So from the get-go, because I work in a controversial industry with you know, people having doubts about my company and about the science that we could put on the table. So we decided from the get-go that we had to make it absolutely transparent and available to everybody. And we have some great science in the area of systems biology. I'm sure Nevin would know our Chief Scientific Officer, Manuel Peich, and he has been, I think, really at the forefront of making sure that this very complex data is shared and made available for other people to look at and other people to come to their own conclusions, not just through peer-reviewed scientific journals, but through making this data, you know, completely accessible so people can dive into it themselves. And I think that's what we would encourage around the world is, you know, let's focus on an open and collaborative discussion and debate about what the data actually says based on facts, based on evidence, and let's put our prejudices to the side. And that way, I believe that we absolutely can move forward and we can make great progress in making sure that we ultimately end the sale of cigarettes, which is our goal as a company. We want to replace them for those who would otherwise continue to smoke. We would like them to switch instead to a better alternative. And that requires disciplined approaches. It requires disciplined review of the evidence, and it requires transparent communication with consumers based on the facts.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Moira. I just wanted to encourage our audience to submit questions if they have them in the Q&A panel. And Brittany, I wanted to ask you, if you were asked to author ground rules to give to a group of policymakers, scientists, private sector leaders, who are all coming together to collaborate on a major global health issue, what would be the key pillars of your ethical code of conduct?
So not just for healthcare, but in terms of, you know, data protection, privacy, and specifically healthcare, because it seems to be more personal and already more regulated than any other type of data. There are three pillars that I think are essential to actually moving forward in a productive way where we are protecting people and we are also allowing our scientists and our technologists, our entrepreneurs to innovate. And that's to have education, legislation and regulation that is common sense, and ethical technology. So on the education front, people need to understand what their data is and what their data rights are in order for them to really give a real opt-in to their data being used for certain purposes. Right now, in most countries around the world, people all are being either submitted for contact tracing. They don't have a choice. It's happening automatically. Or people are saying no because they don't understand the benefits to society of deciding to opt in, or they're opting in without actually understanding what that means and who's getting access to that data and who may be able to use it for whatever purposes that they choose. So education, digital literacy is incredibly important. Next, as I've already talked about, common sense legislation and regulation. Obviously, I think most problems are not solved by just throwing a lot of regulation on it. So I think as little regulation as possible, but common sense regulation, such as saying that we own our own personal information. Now, we are the producers of the world's most valuable asset. The Economist said in 2017 that it surpassed oil and gas. So we are the producers of this multi-trillion-dollar industry, yet somehow in most places around the world, we don't have any control over that, any rights over that. So recognizing in law that we should, at minimum, have transparency over who is collecting our data, what it is going to be used for, and if it's going to be monetized for us to get a dividend off of that, that makes perfect sense to me. And it's already the way that we motivate most people to share their medical data. That's what medical trials are. So we should recognize that right now that a lot of companies are popping up that allow you to put your data onto a data marketplace and monetize that, so that at minimum, you'd be able to feed yourselves and your families every day. So now we're talking about really the third pillar, which is what can technology enable for us? If we have ethical technology that allows us to protect our most private information, but share data that could be useful for scientists and researchers, for example, then we should be doing that. We should be enabling that. Especially right now, when in the United States and in many other places across the globe, we have the highest rates ever of unemployment. At least we've hit over 30% in the United States during this pandemic. So thinking about how you actually take care of your daily needs is one of the most important questions that people and their families are thinking about. So if we are able to monetize our data, and we are able to use that almost as a universal earned income, we're earning it because we are participating in the system, we are opting into sharing our data, we're opting into helping solve this country's problems and global pandemic issues, then yes, that is a huge option. And there are soon to be a lot of platforms that are going to enable that for us.
Great. Well, and Moira, do you believe in Brittany's code of conduct, and what do you think the challenges of would be for the private sector to live by those codes?
So I think the pillars make complete sense. I'll just put my own twist on them for the sector that I'm working on. So, you know, Brittany talked about education, and I think that's really critical in the world I work in. So many smokers around the world think that it's nicotine that causes the problem with smoking, and that, from a scientific perspective, is just wrong. It's not the primary cause of smoking related diseases. It's addictive, clearly, and it's not risk-free, but it's not the main cause of those diseases. And I think so there's a real need for clear and transparent communication to adults who smoke to help them to understand what the problem is and what it isn't. Otherwise, they will never be incentivized to move away from the most harmful form of nicotine consumption, which is combustible cigarettes, to a range of other products which science clearly shows are a much better choice, and that would be heated tobacco products or electronic cigarettes or nicotine pouches. And you know, the second pillar I think that Brittany mentioned was really about regulation. And I think here it's about pragmatic regulation in our area. So it's about recognizing that, yes, regulation should absolutely prevent the uptake of nicotine and tobacco products. It should absolutely encourage people to quit, but it should also pragmatically accept that not everyone will quit. And so for those people, we need to offer them better alternatives that are substantiated by science, and we need to give them truthful information to help encourage them to move away from cigarettes. And then the third piece is, all about technology. And I think it stuns me that people are kind of resistant to technology in the area of smoking and health. It's almost as if, yeah, okay, we've got the solutions we need, which is encouraging people to quit. We don't need anything new. We don't need these new products. They're only going to bring new problems. Well, we wouldn't accept that in any other area of health. We absolutely wouldn't. Science and technology can bring us forward in smoking and health just as it can anywhere else. So I think it's about focusing on what those technologies can bring, making sure that we're bringing them at pace, but then also with care to ensure that there aren't unintended consequences. And that brings you back to regulation. The proper regulation can ensure that you get the most out of technology and prevent these unintended consequences.
Thanks, Moira. I want to ask this question of all of you, and I'm going to start with Nevin because you can each bring a unique perspective to it. Nevin, what do you think, if you were to choose the most important lesson of the pandemic for the science community, what would that be that we could apply for moving forward with other health crises that we're going to face down the road?
Yeah, and it comes back to what we talked about earlier. I would say collaboration, the value of collaboration. Everybody knew collaboration was valuable. I don't think people realized, at least in the scientific world, when we collaborate, how fast we can move. If you think about, this is a virus we didn't even know about in January, and now we're putting drugs into people, 6 months later. That's unheard of in the medical community. So for me, it's the value of working together, the value of breaking down silos, bringing scientists together in academic institutions and also between pharmaceutical companies and the academic world. And the other thing I would say is the value of putting different types of data together. We're just hearing about, this is a session on data. You have different types of data. You have clinical data, you have tracing data, you have molecular data. And the huge challenge, I think, one of the huge challenges is putting that information together in a reasonable way. Everybody's got different types of information, and we need to communicate at a base level of how to put this data together. And then that helps in transparency so that the policymakers can be more accurate with respect to their policies, so that the press can be more responsible and accurate in reporting on the information. So I've always known that, it's valuable to get scientists together, to get different groups together and really understand what types of information they have and how do we put it together. And I've realized even more how important that is. So that's a huge challenge, putting together the infrastructure for different people to communicate more effectively. And we've learned a lot. We got a long way to go. But again, hopefully this type of infrastructure stays in place. So when the next pandemic hits, we're in a much better position to communicate and come up with solutions.
Brittany, what are your thoughts as the most important lesson of the pandemic?
I think one of the most important lessons is that we were fully underprepared for everyone on the planet to be using technology all day, every day, especially kids. And what we really need to think about is implementing more large-scale digital literacy programs. My Own Your Data Foundation teaches a course called DQ, which, like IQ or EQ, stands for Digital Intelligence Quotient. And this has been developed by a lot of the world's top universities, departments and ministries of technology and innovation, think tanks, advocacy groups over 10 years. And this indicator set gives you a DQ score, like your IQ, and a program to test that and to improve upon it. It's supported by the World Economic Forum, OECD. It was released last year as an IEEE global standard, is supported by UNICEF, speaking during UNGA week. And so it's definitely a way for us to move forward in a more equitable way towards the you know, all of the goals that we're trying to hit. I think also what's incredibly important to identify is that we need more technologists, we need more data scientists, not only because we're working with exponentially more data than we had before, but we have more complex problems and needs in terms of human connection, in terms of working online, and in terms of finding ways for that to be, you know, not detrimental to our mental and physical health. So I think a whole new range of both science and technology, entrepreneurship, and of availability for new industries has popped up since March. And I think that's an incredibly exciting opportunity, given that unfortunately we've probably lost the vast majority of small and medium-sized businesses that did not have kind of a core need for their products and service. So with the loss of entire industries of SMEs, I think there's a huge opportunity now for there to be more coders, more data scientists, more technologists to be working on solving the world's greatest problems and helping out, you know, our scientists and our researchers to make sure that something like this never happens again.
Mm-hmm. And Moira, how about you from the standpoint of the private sector? What is, would you say is the most important lesson that's been learned? That we can take forward?
Well, I can't speak for an entire sector, but I can speak for myself. And I think the thing that really has struck me is the importance of responsible and measured communication about science. And I think we've seen this incredible rise of the preprint server during the pandemic. So these are servers where scientists can post manuscripts before they go through a peer review process. And they're absolutely fascinating. I spend every evening pouring through the latest things that are there. It's super quick, it's super responsive. But there is a downside to that, because these non-peer reviewed findings are then finding their way into the media. They're finding their way into scary headlines or overly hopeful headlines. And that is something that we have to be very, very cautious about, because people could end up being misled. And you know, it is great to be transparent. It is great to be quick and get data out there. But at the same time, we have to be absolutely responsible that we're clear about what a study shows, but also what it doesn't show. And yeah, that would be my lesson.
Great. Well, I think we might have time for, we've got a couple of questions from the audience. I'm just going to zip through them. I think we probably will only have time for the first one. This is directed at you, Moira, and it's in a world where data can be manipulated to support certain agenda, how would Philip Morris and others using a scientific approach to make a strong case convince the public and authorities that the data they provide is actually authentic?
Yeah. So I get this type of question an awful lot, and I completely understand why. I know I work in a very controversial industry, and I know that people have strong emotions about smoking and strong emotions about the new products that my company is developing them. And that's why from the very get-go, we decided that we had to make everything absolutely transparently available. We're not asking anybody to trust us. We're asking them to look at the data. We're asking them to redo the studies. We're asking them to come to their own conclusions. Because, you know, we have absolutely nothing to hide, and we have nothing to lose either by making the data public, because we've done it to, I would say, some of the highest standards I've seen. I used to work in the pharmaceutical industry. We've borrowed the techniques and the discipline from pharma, and have been applying it to the development and assessment of smoke-free products for more than a decade now. And I think we have really the highest quality data that you can find. So please don't listen to me and think that I'm asking you to trust me. I'm not. I'm saying go to the data, have a look at our peer-reviewed papers, have a look at the FDA website, and you can see all of the data, hundreds of thousands of pages of data that we submitted to FDA. We have a website that has the source data for our non-clinical studies, for example. So please go and look at that and make your own mind up.
Great. On that note, I want to thank you so much for joining us today, to our audience, and thank you to my panelists, Brittany, Nevin, and Moira. Thanks to our partner PMI, and that concludes our conversations for today. So we hope that you found our time today valuable, and we look forward to seeing you at one of our events in the near future.